Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my patch 9.2.5 Blood Decay guide. I realize it's a little bit late, but I wanted to make this anyways, just because I want to make some guides and next patch, come out with them faster. But hopefully this one will be updated for Season 4 as well, depending on how many balance changes come out. So if there's big balance changes that affect how Blood Decay functions, I will either take this video down or I'll put a pinned comment down below, and you can read that to make sure that this is all still appropriate for when we enter Season 4, but there's a chance there might not be any balance changes, and this might all stand, in which case, Blood Decay will be a great choice for anybody looking to do raids, Mythic Plus, in that season. This is a guide focused on those PVE sides of things. For a little bit of, I guess, experience, I've cleared the raid on DK, on Blood Decay. I did progression on the last 5 bosses as DK, and I've farmed the other ones as it now as well. We did pretty well. We got World 29th this tier with me tanking. And then I haven't done it as much in the key department. Just got my 3k literally so I could get the conduits for raid. I haven't really been pushing keys this expansion, but I do know what's going on in the keystone space. But so there will be some M+, particularly towards the end of this guide. I'll try and explain how you want to go about doing that, but that's a little bit less expertise for me this expansion than raid. So, Blood Decay. What are the strengths of Blood Decay? Why would you want to play this spec? Well, you do a lot of damage, you're very tanky, you have grips. So there's a lot of nice utility there. You also have AMZ. It's a really, really powerful raid spec to be playing right now. It's not without its weaknesses. Mobility can be a bit of a pain. You are also somewhat in danger to heavy incoming physical damage, especially in cases where you can't death strike. So whenever there's not a target in melee range for you to death strike off of, you're in tremendous pain and will fall over very quickly. So watching for those situations. There are boss fights like Jailer and Rygalon where those are most likely going to be how you will die if you die. That's an important thing to do. And also, again, planning out your movement, making sure you're in the right place, making sure that you're moving because you don't have like a good sprint or distance closer, especially depending on which Covenant you're playing, which we will cover more later in this. So first, let's talk a little bit about itemization and gearing your character. This should be true for both Season 3 and Season 4 if you're watching this in the future. Generally, you're going to want to put your tier pieces everywhere except for gloves. Gloves tend to have the worst stats, so you can put a non-tier piece there. The tier gloves have the worst stats, that is. Or you can put a legendary into gloves as well. Either Unity or the Crimson Rune Weapon legendary can go into gloves. Your stat priority tends to be haste greater than verse, and then mastery and crit both not as great. So the reason that haste is so good, it's reducing your global cooldown, and it's going to give you more heart strikes. And that's really nice because that's going to give you more runic power generation, and more faster runes as well are going to come with the haste. But the big thing that's doing as well this set is with your set bonus. When your rune weapon is active, heart strikes extend the duration of rune weapon by 0.5 seconds and increase your strength by 1%. So that stacks up to 40 times, and that persists for 10 seconds after rune weapon ends. Now, this triggers for each of your rune weapons as well. So once you have your 4-piece that says Dancing Rune Weapon now summons 2 rune weapons, every single time you heart strike, which can also be on that other part of your 4-piece that says when you take damage you have a chance equal to 100% of your parry to lash out, heart striking your attacker, that will give you 1.5 extra seconds on rune weapon. So the higher the haste you have, the more heart strikes you're doing, which means the longer your uptime on rune weapon is going to be. In addition to the much more runic power that you're generating, much more death strikes that you're going to get to cast. So it's a very, very good statistic, both for damage and for survivability this patch. It was a good stat before as well, but I would say it was maybe about on par with Verse. Now it's definitely clearly the best Blood Decay stat. It's worth noting about this 4-piece, the chance equal to 100% of your parry. Some people see this and they're like, oh, parry. I can get more parry with crit rating, which is true, but that's not actually the limiting factor for how often the 4-piece effect is going to trigger. The 4-piece has an internal cooldown of 3 seconds, so usually what's gonna cap your rate of triggering this 4-piece is that internal cooldown. Usually it's gonna proc if you're taking reasonable amounts of damage. roughly every 3 seconds, 3.5 seconds or so, you're going to proc this thing, and increasing your parry value from like 60% while rune weapons up to 65 is not actually a huge increase in how many heart strikes you're going to get from this 4-piece. So don't get baited into looking at that parry value thing too much. The big thing is not written in the text here, but it is an internal cooldown of 3 seconds that affects how often that 4-piece is going to trigger. So yeah, set bonuses are very strong here for Blood Decay. It's worth sacrificing item levels, catalyzing some 236 garbage, and getting your set bonus online. Very valuable. When we get to Season 4 and you're able to create whatever items you want, or buy the raid items that you want, once you get to that point, if you're doing the raid and able to do that, the items I would recommend for you are the Jailer Weapon is the first thing you want to grab, the Gavel of the First Arbiter. Obviously, at whatever item level you can find this thing at would be very, very good. It just does so much damage. So definitely very valuable. Then for trinkets, these 2 raid trinkets I recommend for raid progression, even at their Sanctum levels, which I'm currently wearing. But especially in Season 4, once you'll be able to get these at Fated item level, these things are very, very good. Weave of Warped Fates is a cheat death trinket. That's very valuable on Blood Decay because you're somewhat prone to dying by surprise, especially if you stop paying attention for like 2 seconds and don't parry, that kind of thing. So very valuable for Mythic grade progression is 1 or potentially even 2 cheat death effects, or potentially even 3 cheat death effects on Blood Decay. There's another one from Castle Nathria as well that you can use, especially like if this drops for you before the Weave of Warped Fates does from Fated raids next season. This is a totally fine one to use as well. It does explode and kill your allies that are standing near you a little bit as well, but that's the risk they took when they signed up to play with such a pro gamer as yourself. The other one here, Old Warrior's Soul, very, very strong stat stick. If you can get your hands on this thing, it's worth it at normal item level, heroic item level, mythic item level, obviously fated item level, best in slot stat stick by a mile for raid situations. In Mythic Plus, the stacks can fall off. It can be a little bit less good. But in raid situations, this thing is just giving you ungodly amounts of haste, your best stat. And that the second equip effect, it's kind of whatever. It's not the big part. It's just so much haste that this thing is really, really, really good. If you can't get your hands on this, generic stat stick items like Solia's Secret Technique from M+, Elegy of the Eternals from Sepulcher, Stone Legion Generals, Heraldry, this thing from Castle Nathria at Fated item level. Once that's available, those sorts of things are fine there. Codex of the First Technique, another fine trinket from M+. I don't really like Scale from DOS on DK, but it's not bad either. And the Shard from the 9 in Sanctum is another one that you can use for certain raid encounters. I quite like it on fight like Anduin, for instance, because you're taking lots of medium to small sized hits, and that's where that trinket shines. But for the most part, if you can get your hands on these 2, you can just use these and forget about ever swapping them, and you're going to be just fine as a result. Other than that, there's not really too much else to go on with itemization. If you can, crafting a quick Oxane ring or necklace usually is a good idea. Get the one that has Avoidance and this heal proc on it, because Avoidance is just pretty high value. It's a nice little benefit, and you can get this thing 262 socketed from the auction house for 20k or whatever, depending on which server you're on. Do recommend that. And yeah, and then just get the high item level gear, get the gear with haste and verse if you can. Don't drop too many item levels to drop your haste or to switch from like crit and mastery towards haste and verse. You can drop a few, especially if it's like exactly crit mastery to exactly haste verse, but really you are looking for item level as well. Strength and stamina are both, and armor are all good stats for you as well, so you do not want to be giving up too many of those. For legendaries, obviously Unity can go anywhere, just replace whatever a nice low item level slot is. The other one that we use in almost all situations is the Crimson Rune weapon, which Rune Weapon makes 5 Bone Shield charges. Okay, quality of life, that's kind of nice. When a charge is consumed, the cooldown of Rune Weapon is reduced by 5 seconds, and when Rune Weapon fades, your rune regen rate is increased by 40% for 10 seconds. So the big line of text here is 5 seconds reduction on the cooldown of your Rune Weapon every time a charge of Bone Shield is consumed. This is a big part of what's getting us towards full uptime or close to it on our Rune Weapon. And Yeah, this with the current set bonus, this is something that you can basically just craft and never swap off of and be fine. It crafts onto shoulder, waist, and hands. I recommend either doing waist or hands, depending on what your worst slot is there. And shoulder is probably good to save for tier if you can either catalyze it or get your hands on it, because it's good stats in that spot. But, you know, short term, if you happen to have good gloves and a belt, and you don't have good shoulders, go ahead and craft this on shoulders short term. Just scrap it later. So do that if you're willing to spend the gold on that. Other than that, you really don't need to worry about crafting any of these other legendaries this season, this patch, because that combo is so strong. It also informs some of our talent choices. So these top 4 rows are basically, you can always pick these and you'll always be fine. Talent choices. Tombstone, not a pick that's been made until this season. Instant, consume up to 5 bone shield charges. For each charge consumed, you gain some runic power and absorb some damage. Not a particularly strong looking talent. The big strength of this is the interaction with the rune weapon legendary, which says when you consume a charge of bone shield, the cooldown of rune weapon is reduced by 5 seconds. This consumes up to 5 charges of bone shield, so whenever you press your tombstone, you get 25 seconds off your rune weapon cooldown. Very good. So pick this button, press it. Don't try and press it for runic power. Don't try and press it for shield. Don't worry about those parts. Literally just press it. Whenever it's off cooldown, you have more than 5 charges of bone shield, and your rune weapon is not off cooldown or not like about to be off cooldown. A very common thing to do is go like rune weapon tombstone right afterwards and, you know, spend these 5 bone shield charges right back into cooldown reduction, and then hit Marrow Rend to go up to 9 bone shield charges, because of course Marrow Rend gives you 3 bone shield charges, and you got 2 extra rune weapons, so they will bring you all the way up to, they'll each cast it as well. You'll get to 9 and be all set on your rune weapons for the foreseeable future, or on your bone shields for the foreseeable future. That's the only real rotational part about Blood Decay that you need to worry about, is just don't ever take an auto attack without bone shield up, and don't ever just let bone shield be down, ever. Bone shield gives you 10% haste while it's active, in addition to the armor it gives you, so it's not even a DPS increase to leave bone shields on the floor. You've got to make sure you have at least 1 stack of bone shield. Ideally, you want to go over 5 as well, because you have a passive called Ossuary that says when you have at least 5, the cost of Death Strike is reduced by some runic power, by 5 runic power. But if you're hanging out at 3 or 4 bone shields and you don't have Ossuary up, it's fine. You usually have enough runic power this patch to not worry too much about it. All right. Other talents, Hemostasis, just better than Rapid Decomposition or Consumption right now. Big value, just make sure you're hitting your blood boils. Blood Tap, you can literally just press this thing off cooldown pretty much and get some extra free runes and not worry too much about it. It's going to be more value than Bulwark or Relish. If you really hate having an extra keybind, you can try one of the, you can use one of the other ones. It's not the end of the world, but it's a lot of extra runes, and that is extra heart strikes, and that's extra rune weapon uptime, and it all fills this nice cycle of very good DK this patch. And then Will of Necropolis, you basically, this thing is unbelievably powerful. Damage taken below 30% health is reduced by 30%, is a huge amount of effective HP, particularly against the things you need effective HP against, which are the things that might kill you, because by definition, anything that might kill you is doing damage to you below 30% health. So a huge, huge damage reduction effect against those things. This works in a prorated fashion against incoming damage, such that if you're at 50% health and you would take a hit for 55% of your health, okay, that first 20% of your health just doesn't get DR'd, but then the next 35% of your health that's coming through gets reduced by 30%, and bang, you live, right? You don't actually go down to that. So very, very potent effect for DK. Do not get baited into clicking one of these other buttons unless you really know what you're doing. I haven't done it. There are people always make arguments for anti-magic barrier on various fights, but just click Will of Necropolis and then never look at that row again. These rows, by contrast, rows 5, 6, and 7, are preference or fight dependent. Grip of the Dead, really powerful in Mythic Plus. AoE slow effect on your Death and Decay. It's potent on some raid encounters as well. You can get some value out of this on fights like Anduin, fights like Rygolon, if you want to be slowing the Quasars, slowing the Anduin ads. On the other hand, you can get value out of the other picks on this row there as well. Usually this isn't something you want in raid compared to Wraithwalk, which is just a good generic choice for raid. giving you a little bit more movement speed. And yeah, I would recommend just defaulting to this one. Tightening Grasp is another option here. That's reducing the cooldown on Gorfreen's Grasp by 30 seconds. Anduin is the encounter where you would consider this, and basically you just want to do this if you need Gorfreen's Grasp. And like if you need Gorfreen's Grasp for, say, the first intermission and the second Monstrous Soul ad, this Tightening Grasp will get you the cooldown timing to let you do both of those mass grips. Otherwise, you won't have enough cooldown to do that. Just look at your assignments and go into a log and see where your grips are going to be needed and see if you need to do that. Otherwise, I would actually still use Grip of the Dead on that fight because it's really nice downstairs for keeping the ads from walking into Anduin. And then back in the other raids, in Sanctum and Castle Nathria, again, you can kind of figure out if you're needing to press Mass Grip on an encounter, then maybe Tightening Grasp is the one to consider. So something like Soul Render Dormazane, you might be wanting Mass Grip on a lower cooldown. This row, Voracious is a pretty nice default choice you can go with. Some people like Bloodworms as well. It actually does some damage, unlike Voracious, which doesn't do any. Bloodworms doesn't do much either. And it's a nice kind of pseudo... Like, it triggers automatically when you drop below 50% health, but if you're a DK and you're doing hard content, you're dropping below 50% health every couple of seconds. So, yeah, I mean, they do heal you. They get you some extra free healing. I prefer Voracious because it's more under my control rather than the sort of random nature of the Bloodworms, but up to you. Your mileage may vary. And then this last row, there's a huge amount of options here. Bone Storm is great for if you're feeling comfortable in Mythic Plus. It's a great damage choice. Red Thirst, I quite like because I just love pressing Vampiric Blood all the time and having it up always is really nice for if you're trying to like duo tank the last 5% on Mythic Anduin. Having Red Thirst is like a lot of extra Vamp Bloods in that situation. It's a lot, like you can Vamp Blood way more, the Jailer Shattering Blasts, you can do all that kind of stuff. But as we mentioned with the trinkets, Purgatory, a cheat death style effect, is really valuable for DKs as well. So I don't blame people for picking this. It's not a great... It is the worst cheat death effect in the game, probably, because you still have to heal all the way through it. But it's really nice in that it only has a 4-minute cooldown. So this thing can trigger multiple times per encounter. It does only give you 3 seconds of safety. But unlike Pod Tender or whatever, it doesn't take you out of commission while it's triggering either. So perhaps I'm too harsh on Purgatory, but I personally viscerally don't like this talent. So I usually am finding an excuse to use one of the other ones. That might be a weakness in my play, though. So definitely Purgatory is something to seriously consider, especially if you're ever dying and you aren't finding that you like are using Vamp Blood on cooldown a lot with Red Thirst. Then, go Purg. It'll be better. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Covenant selection. A generic default for Blood DK can be Necrolord. You can play Plague Deviser and just plop some stuff in here. It'll be fine. The only thing you might want to do, Reinforced Shell, is a nice endurance conduit that you could put in over something like Hardened Bones in here, or you could go down here and get it instead of this Finesse conduit and Undulating Maneuvers. Undulating Maneuvers, is nice, but it's kind of whatever. And you can go in here and you could put Reinforced Shell and be a little bit nicer to your raid, get a little bit of a bigger AMZ. Other than that, though, yeah, this kind of just generic tree is a very good way to set up your DK if you're playing Necrolord. The one thing to remember is because of the way Volatile Solvent works, you're going to want to press Fleshcraft roughly on cooldown. Like, don't let it sit off cooldown. You can save it for an event that you want to use to get the CC immunity from Ultimate Form for, but don't just never press Fleshcraft during an encounter if you don't need it, because by just tapping it for a second, you're going to get 120 Mastery for the next 2 minutes. And that Mastery actually does come with some offensive benefits. Mastery does increase the shield that your Death Strike gives you, but it also increases your attack power. So spending a global on Fleshcraft for 120 Mastery is a solid DPS increase to make sure you're doing, or saving your Fleshcraft for something you want a damage reduction against, something you want a shield for, or something you want knockback immunity against are also perfectly valid ways to do it. Just don't not push it, is all I'm trying to say. Necrolord is really great, though, because, yeah, you get Abomination Limb. This is just an unbelievably powerful effect. A lot of raid encounters this is really good for. And with the Unity power, it gives you a nice DPS cooldown as well. So looking specifically at Sepulchre, the first ones, you can use Necrolord pretty effectively on every encounter if you wanted to. The one I would be a little bit weary about is Rygolon, because you do not want to just grip the Quasars into the boss, so do not play Necrolord on this encounter unless you know you will be able to press it only during times where it won't grief the raid. Instead, I would recommend a different Covenant for this boss. Now, yeah, other than that, you could run Necrolord on absolutely everything and be just fine. Kyrian is another Covenant that you can use for some situations. If you're playing Kyrian, you generally want to go Mechanicos and use something like this tree here. And the Kyrian power is really strong. Shackle the Unworthy does a lot of damage, and it spreads and gives you more runes whenever it spreads because of the Unity power that you get, right? You gain a rune every time Shackle is either applied initially or spread, and you get a damage increase. So in any multi-target situation, you can spam, your Heart Strikes spread around your Shackle and get your runes right back and just keep spamming more Heart Strikes, which feeds back into the 4-piece, 2-piece set bonus loop, where you're now going to be getting unbelievable uptime on Rune Weapon as well as all this. And so this is really, really, really good for damage, provided you're in a situation where you can spread your Shackle. It's kind of anemic on pure single target, but it's very good if you can spread it. So any raid encounter where you can do that, it'll do a lot of damage. Vigilant Guardian, you do a lot of damage with Kyrian, although maybe you want the utility from the Necrolord grips. If you're doing progression on an encounter like this, you can do that instead. Zymox, even the intermissions, the platforms, Kyrian, a lot of damage there. Might be the best thing you could do, although again, the grip utility is probably better for progression. Pantheon, great choice for Kyrian, right? 4 bosses that it's going to spread between, plus maybe a Ritualist that you're standing on. Lehuvim, you probably want to be Necrolord, grip the ads under the middle of the boss. Halandras, I actually would probably I'd play Necrolord on this one. It's like knockback immunity is nice against the Shatter, so that's really valuable there. But you could also play like Fae, which we'll talk about in a sec, on encounters like that. Anduin, you want to be Necrolord, grip the ads, do the downstairs intermission. Lords of Dread, Necrolord lines up really nicely because it's a 2-minute damage cooldown, and there are AoE damage phases roughly every 2 minutes you can get a lot of value out of. Rygolon, I would recommend Night Fae for as well, although you can play Kyrian to good effect here. And then Jailer, I would recommend Necrolord for, although I played Night Fae on it, but I kind of regret that now, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it for anybody getting started on it more currently. The Necrolord is just really good for breaking out the P2 mind controls really quickly, doing a lot of damage to those and keeping them all gripped under the boss. Like twice in that phase, really, really valuable way to add to that fight. And Night Fae is really good for so Night Fae is good for damage. It's a nice little bit of extra mobility, right? The soul shapes, really nice to get. I would recommend playing Dreamweaver generally if you're playing Night Fae. Nice little bit of extra value. That Pod Tender, not bad too. But yeah, and then the Fae, you're going to get extra strength from your Death's Due. You're going to get extra runic power generation. You can do a lot of damage, particularly in Bloodlust, while you are Night Fae. It's a little bit more fiddly to use because you need to make sure that you're dropping your D&D and staying in it, and the boss is in it, ideally, and you're refreshing right before it disappears the Death's Due buff. So a lot more management than a lot of the other ones. Using it on Jailer, for instance, there were a lot of times where I had to pretty precisely place my Death's Due so that I would continue to be able to stand in it as the next movements were happening, and the Jailer would stay in it as the next movements were happening. That's quite a lot of work to do. If you are going to play Night Fae, or even if you're not, I would recommend macroing your Death and Decay to @cursor rather than doing it so that you have to actually drag the targeting reticule onto the board. Let's see, yeah, this thing, this circle, this is very bad. Anytime you have anything rotational that you're pressing more than once per minute and you're seeing this green circle, you got to stop that. This is costing you a lot of globals over the course of an encounter. Most abilities, right, you can queue up and spam them and they'll automatically go off when your global is off cooldown. You can't do that if you have to click a reticle. It doesn't queue up like that. And you need extra time to actually look and confirm where you're going. So @cursor, much better because you can just press it and bang, down it goes. You do need to be precise with your mouse, but the ceiling of how much value you can get out of those things is much higher. So big recommend. Even if you're not playing Fae, do that for your Death and Decay. But especially if you're playing Fae, it's very important because, again, your Death's Due is so important if you are Fae. So Fae for Rygolon is something you can do. I would recommend it there. I wouldn't actually recommend it for the other encounters, although you could play it on all the single target encounters before and be just fine. But Yeah, Rygolon is the one where I actually think it's like definitely great. Kyrian, totally fine for that too, though, if you'd prefer and you don't want to worry about Death's Due. And Venthyr we don't see too much of in raid-type situations. Going back to places like Sanctum and Castle, again, you can just use Necrolord for most of these encounters and be totally fine. And that's probably would be my default. And then if you realize you want some mobility, some single target damage, that would be a place to consider instead going over to Fae. But honestly, I think, yeah, the only, I don't know, maybe you could play Venthyr on Sire just for Door of Shadows in P2 as well. Might be something worth thinking about, but other than that, yeah, wouldn't be too bothered by it. Goblin, really good race if you're trying to do high-end raid content on a DK, because Goblin Jump gives you a momentum canceling effect. You know, if you're getting knocked back, you can press Goblin Jump and avoid being knocked back and change your momentum. If you need to cover a gap, if you need to quickly get somewhere, all of those things are things that DK doesn't have a lot in their kit to deal with. And so Goblin Jump is really quite irreplaceably valuable. I would very much recommend it for anybody trying to do high-end Mythic content. If you're not trying to do high-end Mythic content, you might want to choose a race that is less painful to look at, and I would not blame you for doing that. All right, real quick, let's talk about Mythic Plus. For Mythic Plus, you generally just want to be Kyrian. Again, you want to be Kyrian, Slam Mechanicos. Where's my Soulbinds? Yeah, Slam Mechanicos, and you can just kind of go with pretty similar stuff. Again, the Cheat Death Trinket, the Old Warrior's Soul, probably a little bit less important here. You can play stuff like Codex, the first technique. Yeah, just kind of whatever you want to go in there can be just fine. The, yeah, Solia's, Elegy, Old Warrior's Soul still fine. Shard of Anhild's Aegis. You could still use a Cheat Death Trinket if you want. Definitely totally fine. But these ones are more like raid-oriented trinkets, so you don't need them as much for M+. And then, yeah, for M+, the big thing you're doing is you're just getting huge amounts of value out of Shackle, Rune Weapon, and you're just trying to make sure that you always have Rune Weapon up, basically, whenever you're tanking stuff. Don't hit Rune Weapon towards the end of a pack if you can avoid it, and it's about to fall off, because you'll want it for the start of the next pack. And generally, this is true for both Raid and M+, the Blood Decay is at its squishiest going into a pull. This tier, Rune Weapon mitigates a lot of that if you have Rune Weapon going into a pull, but you should still not be afraid to press cooldowns like Vamp Blood, Lichborn, IBF, any of that kind of stuff on pull, rather than saving it for later in the pull. Rune Tap, if you're playing Kyrian in M+, you actually have infinite runes because of the way your Shackle spreading is going to work. So if you're going to press Shackle, you can also just press Rune Tap for free. It's off the global cooldown, and it gives you 20% DR. And so assuming that it doesn't cost you a rune because you're getting that rune back from your Shackle spreads, that can be a really nice thing to do near the start of the pull, is just burn your Rune Tap charges. In situations other than that, especially in Raid and stuff, and actually in M+, besides that, the one rune cost of Rune Tap is generally not worth the 20% DR unless you have a good reason for it. So I use Rune Tap specifically against mechanics, like against specific mechanics for specific reasons, but I don't press it rotationally ever otherwise. So like the Jailer, I will use Rune Tap basically against all the mechanics in the Dungeon Journal that have this little tank mechanic next to it. Tank alert, right? If I'm tanking a Martyrdom, I'll press Rune Tap. If I'm tanking a Shattering Blast, I'll press Rune Tap. Other than that, if I'm tanking a Meteor Cleave in P4 Mythic, I'll press Rune Tap. But other than that, I will use my runes instead on Heartstrike, because that's more damage and defense in the long term, right? This is more for like if there's a short-term burst of damage coming in that you want a little bit of extra mitigation against. Yeah. Okay, I think I've covered all the stuff I was intending to. A couple other macros you might be interested in. You might be interested in a mouse over Death Grip / cast open brackets at mouse over Death Grip. I guess open brackets at mouse over close brackets Death Grip. That can be nice for just mouse over death gripping something. Some people don't like that because it's imprecise. You can do it with focus as well if you want instead, but having a way to quickly death grip something can make things a lot more valuable, and not having to like target things can be nice. Yeah. We talked about Rune Tap. That's good. I think we've talked about pretty much everything. Oh, your Ghoul. You have a fun Ghoul you can summon with Raise Dead. Just press this button on cooldown. Don't worry too much about the Sacrificial Pact that it lets you do, but just just summon your ghoul whenever you can. It'll do a little bit extra damage, and if you want, you can try and sacrifice it for towards the end of its lifespan to do a little bit of damage. But I don't know, it costs some runic power. You don't have to worry about this patch. You'll be totally fine. There's probably too many brain globals to start thinking about if you're new to DK. What this can be nice for is if you're in that situation I was talking about where you're dying because you're away from the boss. There you can explode your ghoul to give yourself some healing. Another thing you're technically allowed to do if you are looking for some healing, you can Lichborn and then Death Coil yourself for some healing. That is something that will let you spend your runic power to heal yourself while you're at range of the boss. But unlike Deathstrike, it doesn't scale based on how much damage you've taken recently. So do not do this as a normal plan ever, but under very specific circumstances, you can use this if you're like out of range of a boss and you really need a little bit extra healing. Mostly I would recommend Health Pot and Health Stone, and most people do not need more than just pressing their Health Pot and Health Stone whenever that comes up to be just fine. Yeah. I think that's all I got for DK. I'm going to put some resources in the description below for a website where you can go and just check to see what the DKs, what blood DKs are using on different raid encounters in M+. You can see all the talents, trinkets, legendaries, and stuff that people are using. I would recommend just quickly having a look at that if you're planning to come and bring a DK to something you haven't done before, particularly if like other people that you're doing it with already have done that and they already know what's going on, if you kind of want to be brought up to speed quickly. But it's a really fun spec. This is by far my favorite tank spec. Do ask some questions in the comments if I've forgotten something. You know, you can tell by the nature of this video, not the most professional guide out there, but hopefully it imparted some useful wisdom to you. And I will try to answer whatever I forgot to talk about down in the comments. Again, if there is a pinned comment, that will be whatever updates are necessary for Season 4, or I'll make a new video and pin that in the comments below as well if there actually is too much for just one comment. Hope the video helped. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.